Isn't that a daisy?
You son of a bitch. Hey, Billy, just settle down.
There is a moment, and you know exactly which one, where Val Kilmer tilts his head, lets the ghost of a smile crawl across his lips, and delivers a single line so perfectly that it stops your heartbeat. Or maybe your moment is Kurt Russell, jaw set like granite, those ice blue eyes saying everything the script doesn't. Or Sam Elliott's mustache alone telegraphing more danger than most actors do with their entire bodies. Tombstone. Even saying the name conjures something: red Arizona dust, the crack of a pistol, the click of spurs on wooden planks. For a 1993 Western made in the era of Jurassic Park and action blockbusters, Tombstone had absolutely no business becoming the cult phenomenon it became. And yet here we are, 3 decades later, and people are still quoting it, still watching it, still arguing about whether Doc Holliday is the greatest character in the history of American cinema. But here is the thing about legends: the shinier they look on the surface, the darker the secrets hiding underneath. What if the movie you have loved all these years was almost never finished? What if the performance that made Val Kilmer immortal nearly cost him his life, and then nearly cost him his eye? What if the man you watched as Wyatt Earp was secretly running the entire production from the shadows, forbidden from ever telling anyone? Tombstone has 15 secrets buried deeper than the graves of the OK Corral. Today, every single one gets dug up. Fact 1. Kurt Russell was the real director and was never allowed to say so. Here is a question that should bother every film fan who has ever watched Tombstone. Who actually directed this movie? The official answer is George P. Cosmatos. His name is in the credits. His name is on the poster. And yet, if you sit down with the people who were actually there, the crew members, the cast, and eventually Kurt Russell himself, a completely different story begins to emerge, one that Hollywood kept buried for years. It starts with Kevin Jarre, the man who wrote the screenplay. Jarre was brilliant on paper. His script was detailed, historically rich, and filled with the kind of authentic Old West texture that studios usually beg writers to remove. The studio wanted him to direct too, and that is where everything began to unravel. Jarre was a perfectionist to a degree that bordered on self-destruction. If a horse was running at the wrong speed, they shot it again and again. If the light wasn't right, if a hat sat at the wrong angle, if an extra breathed at the wrong moment, reset, reload, reshoot. Days collapsed. The schedule turned to rubble. Costs exploded. The studio ran out of patience. Kevin Jarre was fired. In that vacuum, Kurt Russell did something extraordinary. He stepped up, quietly, without announcement, without paperwork. The next morning, people simply noticed that Kurt was standing next to the camera. He was reviewing shots. He was adjusting performances. He was cutting dialogue that didn't work. He was deciding angles, blocking scenes, shaping the tone of every moment. He was doing everything a director does, except he had no title and no credit. For the remainder of the production, Tombstone was directed by an uncredited ghost. Russell worked himself to the edge of exhaustion, sleeping a few hours a night while simultaneously acting the role of Wyatt Earp. The studio knew. They allowed it, but they drew a hard line. Kurt Russell was never to speak about it publicly. The film guilds would ask questions. The press would demand answers. Legal problems would follow. So he stayed silent for years. It was only much later, in rare and candid interviews, that Russell finally admitted the truth. Nobody knows what I did behind that camera, but I'll tell you this: if Tombstone survived, it's because I had to carry it day by day, even if my name never appears in the directing credits. Think about that the next time you watch a scene and wonder why it flows so perfectly. The man on screen is the same man who put it together. Fact 2. Val Kilmer deliberately pushed his body to the point of medical collapse. There is method acting. And then there is what Val Kilmer did for Doc Holliday. Kilmer made a decision in pre-production that Doc Holliday would not be performed, he would be inhabited. And if the character was dying of tuberculosis, then Kilmer would make his body tell that story without any assistance from makeup or filters. He kept his body temperature artificially low by lying in cold rooms before scenes. He deliberately dehydrated himself so his skin would dry out. His lips would crack, and his energy would drain naturally. He took short, shallow breaths constantly to mimic lungs that could no longer fully expand. He tensed his muscles into a permanent low-grade state of strain, so that every movement carried the visible weight of a man fighting his own body just to stay upright. Every time he walked in front of that camera, he did not look like an actor playing a dying man. He looked like a man who was actually dying. Crew members stopped trying to joke around him between takes. The atmosphere around Kilmer became almost reverent. One crew member recalled that just looking at him produced genuine sadness. There was nothing performative about it. The suffering radiated off him like heat off the desert floor. Then came the day it went too far. It was a quiet saloon scene. No gunfight, no dramatic confrontation. The camera rolled, and then, without warning, Val Kilmer crumpled to the floor. Everyone assumed it was acting. He was Doc Holliday. Collapsing was on brand. But when the crew moved to help him up, they found his face gray, his breathing barely audible, his pulse weak. The set medic rushed in. They checked his temperature, below normal. They checked his oxygen, insufficient. They asked if he had eaten. His whispered answer, "I'm fine, just a little dehydrated." He was not fine. He had methodically drained his body of what it needed to function, and his body had decided it was done cooperating. The studio ordered complete silence. No medical reports, no official record. Kilmer rested briefly, drank some water, and walked back on set. Years later, he said it himself. To let Doc Holliday live truthfully on screen, I pushed my body as close to the edge of collapse as I could. And honestly, I went too far. There is no CGI in that performance. That is a man who genuinely chose to suffer for his craft, and nearly didn't survive the choice. Fact 3. Val Kilmer almost lost his eye. Filming the most iconic scene in the movie, Doc Holliday versus Johnny Ringo. Two men staring at each other from across a clearing, hands hovering near their guns. The world holding its breath. It is one of the most electric face-offs in the history of westerns. But while you were watching the screen, something was happening just outside the frame that nobody ever told you about. Val Kilmer nearly lost his eye. Blank rounds are not the same as having nothing in the gun. The gunpowder is real. The blast force is real. When a blank fires, it can eject copper wadding or microscopic metal fragments, any of which, traveling at the velocity of a discharged firearm, is capable of destroying human tissue or puncturing an eye. On the day they filmed that confrontation, both Kilmer and Michael Biehn, who played Ringo, were operating at peak intensity. The atmosphere on set was described as so thick with manufactured tension that people nearby felt it physically. The camera rolled, guns came up, and something went wrong with Biehn's weapon. A blank pistol worn down from weeks of daily use on a hot, dusty set. A tiny piece of metal inside the barrel shifted position. When Biehn pulled the trigger, instead of venting the discharge downward as designed, the gun spat a metal fragment sideways, directly toward Val Kilmer's face. The crew heard a sharp metallic ping. They saw Kilmer jerk his head backward. They assumed it was acting. Then, he touched his face. His hand came away with blood on it. The fragment had passed directly beneath his left eye. A matter of centimeters higher and Val Kilmer would have been blinded. Not scarred, not injured. Blinded. The most expressive eyes in the film would have been gone in an instant. Biehn went pale. The set froze, and Kilmer stood there for a long moment, completely still. Then he took a breath and said quietly, "Shall we go again?" He kept filming. No break. No blame directed at Biehn. No demand to halt production. The studio knew within hours and buried it within minutes. If the press had gotten hold of the story, production would have been shut down for a safety investigation. The legal consequences alone would have been catastrophic. So the incident was erased from every official record. It lives only in the memories of those standing there, and in the fact that Kilmer still has two working eyes, which, given what nearly happened, is something close to a miracle. Fact 4. Sam Elliott broke his ribs and kept filming all day. Sam Elliott as Virgil Earp is one of those perfect pieces of casting that looks so right. In retrospect, you cannot imagine the film any other way. The physicality of the man, the quiet authority, the sense that Virgil has weathered things that would break other people. It turns out that quality was not entirely fictional on the day it mattered most. The scene was a town ride. The Earp brothers moving through Tombstone's dusty streets, a shot designed to establish presence and power. Horses, dust, the smell of Arizona heat, dozens of people clustered around the set. When the director called action, Sam Elliott's horse spooked, hard. With no warning, Elliott was thrown, launched sideways out of the saddle and down onto packed desert earth, with an impact that made the entire crew go silent. He did not move for several seconds. Dust settled over him. People began calculating worst-case outcomes. Then Sam Elliott put one hand on his chest, registered the knife-sharp pain that came with every breath, and stood up. No one could believe it. One assistant director recalled standing there thinking they had just watched Virgil Earp break in half, and then watched him get back on the horse as if he had merely tripped over a curb. Elliott had fractured ribs. The pain is not subtle. It is a hot, relentless sensation that sharpens every time you breathe, speak, or move. He had to do all three for the rest of the filming day. Every line of Virgil Earp dialogue from that point was delivered through a man rationing his breath because anything more than half a lungful was agony. He never said a word. He filmed the entire day. He told no one on set. Why? Because Sam Elliott later admitted it plainly. I was afraid they'd replace me. Back then, if you showed even a hint of weakness, you could lose your role overnight. What you see on screen is Virgil Earp, dignified, solid, immovable. What was happening just off camera was a man quietly suffering through one of the more physically brutal days of his professional life, invisible to everyone watching. Fact 5. A deleted gunfight scene nearly put a metal fragment through Kurt Russell's ear. Kurt Russell, the man quietly directing the entire film while playing its lead character, came within centimeters of having a blank gun fragment drill through his ear canal. It happened during a street gunfight sequence eventually cut from the final film. Not because it looked bad, not because the performances failed. It was cut because of what happened during rehearsal. Multiple actors were firing blank rounds simultaneously. An extra, one of dozens of background cowboys, was assigned a simple task: fire a warning shot into the air. Except when he pulled the trigger, his muzzle tilted slightly. The fragment blasted through the air and passed directly next to Kurt Russell's head. Kilmer described hearing a whiz of displaced air. He described seeing Russell immediately grab his ear. The fragment grazed Kurt's ear. Shallow, not deep, not a hospital visit, but the shockwave from the close-range discharge left him dizzy and disoriented. The extra who fired the shot nearly collapsed from the realization of how close he had come to killing the film's star. The studio shut everything down that afternoon. Every prop gun was rechecked, every safety protocol was reviewed, and then everyone was told in the familiar language of 1990s Hollywood crisis management. No one talks about this. Russell addressed it later with the calm of someone who has looked at their own mortality from a very short distance. I didn't realize how lucky I was until they showed me the angle I was standing at. If I had been half a step to the side, I wouldn't be here to say this. The scene never appeared in the film, which means somewhere out there is footage of a moment that nearly ended the life of the man who saved Tombstone from collapsing, and neither you nor I will ever see it. Fact 6. Bill Paxton was so terrified of being overshadowed. He could barely stand up. Being cast in Tombstone meant walking onto a set that included Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer, and Sam Elliott. Three actors who, even in casual conversation, radiate something most people only get from staring at natural landmarks. For Bill Paxton, who had built his career playing relatable, warm, genuinely human characters, this was not a comfortable place to land. He admitted later that standing beside Kurt Russell on his first day felt like standing next to a storm that had taken human form, and Val Kilmer's eyes, even between takes, carried the focused intensity of a predator assessing everything around him. Paxton told people that in real life, Kilmer looked like he could read his thoughts. The anxiety was physical. Paxton rehearsed his lines until his voice gave out. He practiced expressions in mirrors late into the night. Some days, right before cameras rolled, he had to lean against a wall, not to rest, but to stop his hands from shaking. His knees buckled, his heart raced. He felt like someone who had wandered into a room full of professionals and was about to be exposed. One crew member noted that Paxton was always the first person on set every morning, not to rehearse, just to prove to himself that he had the right to be there. But here is where the story turns. Morgan Earp, historically, was the youngest brother, the emotional one, the one who felt things most deeply, who struggled hardest against the violence of his world, who was always trying to hold the family together while it came apart. Without planning it, without being asked, Bill Paxton lived that truth off camera and brought it on camera every single day. He later said, "Standing between Russell, Kilmer, and Elliott, I always felt like the weakest one. The pressure was so intense that some days I had to lean against a wall just to stop shaking. But that fear is exactly what helped me understand Morgan Earp better than anyone else could have." The actor most afraid of not measuring up became the film's most emotionally authentic performance. Fact 7. The 40-degree heat was real, and it made people cough up blood. There is a romanticized quality to the way Tombstone looks on screen. The light is beautiful. The dust is dramatic. The heat shimmers off the streets of that recreated frontier town in a way that feels almost painterly. All of that was authentic, and all of it was brutal. The production filmed in the Arizona desert in genuine summer heat. Temperatures reached 40 degrees Celsius at midday, and the combination of set lighting, camera equipment, and heavy costuming pushed the felt temperature even higher. The actors and crew wore multiple layers: shirt, vest, leather coat, belt, gun holster, wide-brimmed hat, because historical accuracy demanded it. There was no shade built into the location, barely any wind. When horses charged through scenes, they kicked up clouds of fine alkaline dust that coated everything. Every blank round fired added gunpowder particles to the air. The production ran 12-hour days. Crew members began coughing, then actors began coughing, then people began coughing up blood, not from injury, but from pulmonary stress, from fine dust inhaled in extreme heat during sustained physical exertion. One extra described finishing a scene, raising his hand to wipe his mouth and seeing blood mixed with dust on his palm. He described it not with horror, but with the flat tone of someone describing a normal Tuesday. The medical team repeatedly asked to stop filming and let people rest. The response from the producers was direct: "We can't fall behind schedule. The more they cough, the more real it looks." So the crew coughed, drank water, and walked back into it. 12 hours a day. One crew member said, "Some days, by late afternoon, the entire crew was coughing in unison, like a chorus. But they kept acting because no one wanted to be the first to ask for a break. Everything in Tombstone looks real because everything in Tombstone was real. The sweat was real. The dust was real. The coughing was real. And in some cases, so was the blood." Fact 8. Doc Holliday was almost played by someone else, and Kurt Russell threatened to quit. Today it seems impossible to imagine any version of Tombstone in which Val Kilmer did not play Doc Holliday. The role and the man seem fused at the cellular level, but in the initial casting discussions, Kilmer was not the choice. He was not even close to the choice. The studio wanted someone safer, more bankable, more predictable. Kilmer, at that point in his career, had a reputation for being difficult, for having a strong enough artistic vision that he might attempt to pull the entire film in his direction. The fear was specific. They thought Val Kilmer would turn Tombstone into a Val Kilmer movie. Then the reading happened. Kurt Russell was in the room when Kilmer auditioned. He described watching Kilmer work as like watching lightning hit the floor. Kilmer was not reading lines. He was not performing. He was living inside the dialogue in a way that was genuinely difficult to watch comfortably, the way it is difficult to watch someone's genuine grief up close. When it was over, Russell had one position. Val Kilmer plays Doc Holliday. He pushed the studio. He argued. He held his ground. And when the resistance continued, he escalated. If Kilmer was passed over, Russell would walk away from Wyatt Earp. Tombstone without Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday would also be Tombstone without Kurt Russell's Wyatt Earp. The studio eventually yielded. Kilmer walked onto set for the first time, opened his mouth, and the crew went silent. Not politely silent, stunned silent. The kind of silence a room full of professionals who have seen everything goes into when they realize they are witnessing something they will still be talking about decades from now. One crew member put it simply: Doc Holliday had arrived. Fact 9. A stuntman was dragged under a horse and nearly died on camera. Tombstone's battle scenes feel like captured reality. Chaotic, loud, dangerous, teetering permanently on the edge of control. As it turns out, that quality was not entirely an illusion. During a large-scale melee sequence, with dozens of actors and horses charging through a set turned into a miniature war zone, a stuntman was given a straightforward assignment: run across the street, dodge the horses, take a fall. He had done the movement in rehearsal. It was the kind of thing a stunt professional handles without drama. Then his belt buckle caught on a horse's stirrup. The horse was large and moving fast. The jerk went through the stuntman's body like a current. He was pulled off his feet and into the path of a running horse. Then the horse kept running. In the noise of the scene, gunshots, yelling, the thunder of hooves, no one heard him screaming. The dust was so thick, it functioned as a wall. The chaos that made the scene look so authentic was the same chaos that hid a man in genuine mortal danger. The horse dragged him across hard-packed desert earth. Rocks and gravel tore through his clothing. He covered dozens of meters before the animal finally stopped, and when it did, its two front hooves came down directly in front of his face. The margin was described by witnesses as centimeters. When crew members finally reached him, they could barely recognize him under the dirt. He was alive, which was the only thing that mattered, and which, given what they had just witnessed, felt like something it was not fully safe to take for granted. The studio buried it completely. No report, no investigation, no paperwork. The accident exists only in the memories of the people who were there and in the old scars on a stuntman's body. Fact 10. The script was so long, it would have made a 5-hour film. Kevin Jarre's original screenplay for Tombstone was not a script. It was an epic, a historically comprehensive, linguistically rich, emotionally layered document that stretched well beyond anything a studio could put on screen in a single sitting. Jarre was a historian as much as a writer. He wanted everything. Every key figure from the OK Corral, every political thread of the territorial government, every complicated moral dimension of Wyatt Earp's actual biography. His first draft would have produced a film running well over 5 hours. The studio's response was to cut, and cut, and cut again. Characters disappeared. Storylines were excised. Historical nuance was reduced to shorthand. Jarre fought every single cut because he understood that the context was what made the story matter. He lost almost every argument. By the time the script reached a filmable length, Jarre and the studio had developed the kind of working relationship you see between two people who have agreed to continue cooperating while no longer pretending to like each other. The perfectionism that made him extraordinary on the page made him impossible in the director's chair, and when he was finally removed, much of what had survived of his original vision went with him. The Tombstone you watched is a trimmed, compressed version of a much larger story, which raises a question worth sitting with. What would the 5-hour cut have looked like? Fact 11. Powers Boothe almost did not make it to set. Powers Boothe played Curly Bill Brocious with a cheerful, scalded menace that makes him one of the most entertaining villains of the decade. Every scene he appears in has an unpredictable quality. You genuinely cannot tell from moment to moment whether Curly Bill is about to laugh or kill someone, often both. What the audience never knew was that getting Boothe to the set was not straightforward. There were scheduling complications, contract disputes, and the kind of production chaos that follows the abrupt removal of a director mid-shoot. At several points, Boothe's participation was genuinely uncertain. Scenes were written and rewritten around the possibility that Curly Bill might need to be recast. When Boothe finally secured his place and arrived on set, the energy shifted. His particular brand of dangerous humor, unpredictable, a little unhinged, deeply physical, gave the outlaw faction the counterweight it needed against Russell's controlled intensity and Kilmer's focused brilliance. But the film came close to existing without him, and without Curly Bill Brocious operating at that specific voltage, the entire moral architecture of the story would have collapsed. Fact 12. The costume department worked in conditions that rivaled the actors. The conversation around Tombstone's production difficulties focuses almost exclusively on the cast. But the costume department, responsible for making every piece of clothing look like it had genuinely spent a decade in the Old West, worked under conditions that deserve their own documentation, keeping period-accurate costumes intact across weeks of shooting in 40-degree heat, horse-dusty desert environments, and days involving real blood, real sweat, and real physical falls required constant repair and replacement. Leather cracked in the heat, fabric stained, and could not be properly washed between shooting days because the weathered quality was intentional. Wool vests in Arizona summer heat were genuinely dangerous for the people wearing them. The costume team worked before the crew arrived and stayed after the crew left. They kept no records of what the actors' bodies were going through because that was not their job. But they saw everything. They were the first people to know when someone was hurt and the last people to stop working at the end of every shooting day. Fact 13. The OK Corral gunfight was shot in a single day. One of the most famous gun battles in American history. The moment the entire film builds toward. The scene that generations of Western fans consider the genre's definitive set piece. Shot in one day. The production did not have the budget or the schedule to afford more time on the OK Corral sequence. Kurt Russell, directing from inside the actor's position, made decisions about coverage, angles, and performance in real time, under time pressure, in the heat, with a tired crew and actors who had been wearing leather in the Arizona sun for weeks. The fact that the sequence works as well as it does, tight, kinetic, emotionally charged, historically suggestive, even when not historically accurate, is a product of preparation and instinct operating at a very high level, with very little margin for error. One day, one chance, and the result is, the scene people still slow down and rewind. Fact 14. Dana Delaney's role was almost entirely cut. Josephine Marcus, the woman who becomes Wyatt Earp's great love and eventually his lifelong partner, was, in Jara's original vision, a fully realized figure with her own storyline, her own agency, and her own historical complexity. What survived the cutting process was significantly reduced. Dana Delaney's role in the theatrical release is a fraction of what was written for the character, and in some early cuts it was reduced further still before being partially restored. The historical Josephine Marcus is one of the most interesting figures connected to the Tombstone story, a former actress, a woman who operated entirely outside the conventional expectations of her era, and the person who ultimately outlived Earp and shaped how his story was told to subsequent generations. Almost none of that made it into the film. Delaney worked with the material she had and made it count. But the role you see is the remnant of a much larger story about a woman who deserved far more screen time than she received. Fact 15. The film was declared dead on arrival, and then became a legend. When Tombstone opened in December 1993, it was entering a marketplace that had not asked for it. Westerns were commercially toxic. Unforgiven, the previous year, had succeeded because it was Clint Eastwood being anti-mythological. Tombstone was doing something different, embracing the mythology, leaning into heroism, offering the kind of spectacular Western grandeur that critics had been dismissing as naive for 2 decades. The early reviews were mixed. The theatrical run was solid, but not spectacular. By traditional Hollywood metrics, Tombstone was a modest success at best. Then the home video release happened. Something about Tombstone on repeat viewing revealed itself more fully than it had on first viewing. People bought the VHS. They watched it again. They quoted it to each other. They pressed it on friends. The word of mouth that builds slowly, through years of repeated watching and sharing, eventually transformed Tombstone from a modest theatrical film into one of the most beloved westerns ever made. The studio that had fought over every dollar of its budget and tried to control every moment of its creation did not make Tombstone a legend. The audience did. The people who kept watching it, kept talking about it, kept going back to that Arizona dust and those cold blue eyes and that one line from a dying man that sounds like a poem. That is how Tombstone survived. Not because Hollywood protected it, because audiences refused to let it go. Tombstone looks like pure myth on screen. Cowboys moving through red dust, guns gleaming, eyes cold as winter sky. But peel back every frame and what you find underneath is something rawer and more human. Sweat, blood, fractured ribs, near blindings, buried accidents, exhausted people doing extraordinary things in brutal conditions, and a film that survived its own production only because one man quietly refused to let it die. The legend is real, and now you know exactly how much it cost. Tell us in the comments, which of these 15 facts hit hardest? And if you want more buried truths about the films and moments that shape cinema, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The next story is already waiting.